let's get right to it. Would the United States actually go to war with China to defend Taiwan? I mean, it's one of the biggest, most consequential questions in the world today. And for decades, the official answer has been a very deliberate maybe. But lately, that carefully constructed ambiguity has really started to feel like it's coming apart at the seams. So, what is the real American position? Let's unpack it.
To really get a feel for this, we've got to start right on the edge, on Taiwan's Kinmen Islands. These islands are just 3 miles from mainland China, and what used to be a heavily fortified military garrison, a place that actually fought off invasions, has slowly, weirdly transformed. Where you once had 100,000 troops, now you have thousands of tourists, many of them from the mainland, just taking a ferry over. This giant wall of speakers, it used to blast propaganda. Now it plays pop music. It's this perfect symbol of a really dramatic but incredibly tense peace.
And right in the middle of all this tension, President Joe Biden says something that sends absolute shockwaves through the foreign policy world. He seemed to draw this crystal clear red line, putting the defense of Taiwan on the same level as a sacred commitment, just like America's formal treaty allies.
So you hear that, and you think, case closed, right? Well, not so fast. Because as clear as that sounds, the official answer is way more complicated. In fact, for more than 40 years, the official answer has been designed to be complicated. So to get our heads around this puzzle, here's what we're going to do. We'll start with all the recent confusion, then we'll hit rewind and see where this unique policy came from. After that, we'll look at how it's supposed to keep the peace, dig into what China really thinks about all this, and then finally talk about the incredibly tricky path forward.
Okay, first up, the confusion. And the thing is, President Biden didn't just make this seemingly clear statement once. Nope, he did it 4 separate times, and each time he got a little more specific. It started with him just lumping Taiwan in with treaty allies. Then he flat out confirmed the U.S. would defend Taiwan. Then he specified that meant intervening militarily. And finally, he made it clear that we're talking about American troops on the ground. And after every single one of these statements, the White House would come out and say, no, nothing has changed. Our long-standing policy remains the same.
So you can imagine what people were thinking, right? For a lot of experts, the takeaway was pretty obvious. This foundational U.S. policy, something that every president since Jimmy Carter had stuck to, looked like it had just been thrown out the window, live on television.
So, what is this policy of strategic ambiguity? Why was everyone so worked up about it being abandoned? To get that, we need to jump in the time machine for a second and see how this whole thing started.
For a long time, about 30 years after the Chinese Civil War, things were super clear. The U.S. had a formal, official mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. American troops were even stationed there. But then, in 1979, everything changed. The Carter administration made this historic pivot and officially recognized the government in Beijing as the one sole government of China.
So to replace that old treaty, the U.S. Congress came up with this thing called the Taiwan Relations Act. And here's the absolute key distinction. It does not require the U.S. to defend Taiwan. What it does is obligate Washington to help Taiwan defend itself. It creates an option for the U.S. to step in, but not a sacred obligation.
And that right there is what everyone calls the policy of strategic ambiguity. It's not some official name on a law, it's just what we call this new reality. The deliberate, careful choice to keep both Beijing and Taipei guessing about what America would actually do if things went sideways. Now, here's where it gets really clever. The reason this policy exists, it's not just about stopping China from attacking. It's also about stopping Taiwan from making a break for it and declaring formal independence. Think of it like this. The U.S. is basically playing referee, and its big rule is nobody changes the status quo on their own. So, back in the 2000s, when Taiwan's president at the time made some symbolic moves towards independence, the Bush administration openly, publicly criticized him. It shows you this policy really does cut both ways. It's this weird, delicate dance. The ambiguity lets both Beijing and Taipei wear what you could call rose-colored glasses. Each side can tell themselves a story they like. A story where time is on their side. And that makes this deeply unsatisfying situation, the status quo, the least bad option for everybody. And it helps put off a potentially catastrophic conflict.
All right, so if the whole point is to be ambiguous, did President Biden's very clear statements change anything for China? Well, this is where the story takes a major plot twist. Here's the kicker. For China's military planners, this is not new information. They have always assumed the U.S. would jump in if there was a conflict. I mean, from a strategic point of view, preparing for anything less would be just reckless. A huge chunk of their military spending is aimed specifically at what they call denying third-party intervention. And let's be honest, we all know who that third party is.
So this means that when Beijing reacted to Biden's words, they weren't freaking out about a new military threat. They were worried about a political one. They were concerned that what Biden said was a signal, a green light, maybe, that might encourage those separatist forces in Taiwan and suggest the U.S. was finally ditching the status quo. And this is how you get into a really dangerous feedback loop. It goes like this. China gets worried the U.S. is shifting its policy, so it acts aggressively to show it's serious. The U.S. sees that aggression and thinks, whoa, they're trying to upset the balance, so it acts to restore that balance. But then China sees that move as even more proof that the U.S. is up to something, and the spiral just keeps going, pushing both sides closer to a conflict that neither one of them might actually want. So, how do you break out of that dangerous spiral? That is the million-dollar question for American policy. How do you deter China without provoking them into the exact fight you're trying so hard to avoid? Well, one of the big ideas that's been around for a while is what's called the porcupine strategy. The thinking is, instead of buying flashy, expensive things like fighter jets, Taiwan should invest in a huge number of smaller defensive things. We're talking about sea mines, anti-ship missiles, things that would make an invasion so difficult, so painful, that it just wouldn't be worth the cost. It's all about becoming too spiky to swallow without crossing China's biggest political red lines. And that brings us right back to where we started, with this incredibly tough dilemma. It's a question that has somehow maintained a fragile peace for over 40 years, and finding the right answer to it will continue to define one of the most dangerous flashpoints on the entire planet.